Hey, it's Coach Anderson here from Mississippi Public Broadcasting Online U.S. History from 1877 to present. Today we're going to pick up again, of course, with Unit Number 3, Urban America, and we're also going to look at Lesson 4, Politics of the Gilded Age. Now, we talked a little bit about what it was like, of course, living in the Gilded Age and some of the issues that came up. Now we're going to talk about the political side of it in terms of what was our government doing and what issues, of course, was it facing or trying to address. When you look at unit focus question, once again, we have two questions that will guide our thoughts throughout this particular unit. We will answer them at the end, not after the lesson. Why do people migrate? Number one. Number two, how is urban life different from rural life? Now, we've already been able to look at a few things that could possibly help us answer those questions, but hold your answers, of course, until a little bit later. All right, I do now activity. What you do is take out your journals, and in your journals write down the topic, and it says identify the two major political parties that exist in American politics and their leaders at the current time. So if you will, take a few minutes and answer those particular questions, and we'll come back and discuss them in a few minutes. Okay? You should have had enough time that you were able to go through, of course, and write down where the two major political parties in the United States of America is. Those two parties, of course, are the Republican Party, led by President, the nominee, of course, for president in the 2024 election, Donald J. Trump, of course, and then looking today, the leader of the Democratic Party that's still in the White House will be Joseph R. Biden. So, in terms of looking at those two political parties, they're diametrically different in terms of what they espouse. If you look at the Democrats, they're more liberal in their thinking, and then the Republicans a little bit more conservative in their thinking. As we go on, we'll talk about the difference between liberals, of course, and conservatives at a little bit later date. But now what we're going to do is look at our guided reading question, and the question is why did the spoils system become such a source of political debate during the Gilded Age? Well, in looking at the vocabulary, well, this is the vocabulary we have, and what we will do, of course, is look at this vocabulary. You have academic and content. What we want you to do, of course, is write these terms down and define them yourself. But we'll try to address as many of them as we can as we go on, of course, in the lesson. Politics in Washington is going to be the first topic that we're going to address. It says the federal government post-Civil War was primarily controlled by the Republican Party, which favored supporting big business interests of laissez-faire and no government regulation. The federal government up until the 1880s was filled mostly with government workers appointed through patronage or party loyalty. In other words, you get a government job based on how much support you gave someone. So if your friend, of course, helped you get elected, then you might put him in a position, of course, to kind of reward him for the hard work he did, of course, to get you in the position that you were in. Now, that doesn't really sound like a sound policy for hiring people, but this is what happened. And all too often, the patronage in the federal government led to corruption and ineptitude. The person most responsible for this idea of patronage was the President of the United States of America. At one point, he was the general that won the Battle of New Orleans. His name is Andrew Jackson from the great state of Tennessee. And he made the statement, "To the victor belongs the spoils." In other words, the spoils system. He said that by virtue of him being, of course, the winner in a battle, then that the men, of course, that he leads and himself, they were entitled to the spoils of war, which means that if you're president of the United States of America, you're entitled to the spoils of government, which means you should be allowed to appoint people that you want in the positions that you want in the federal government. Civil service reform. The corruption and ineptitude of the federal government started the push for civil service reform. Civil service reform and civil service are all those jobs in the government, jobs in the government. The first attempt at reform was in 1877 by President Rutherford B. Hayes. His attempt caused a split in the Republican Party between the stalwarts and the half-breeds. Stalwarts who supported the idea of the spoils system and liked the idea of it, and then half-breeds who favored some reform. In 1880, the two people running for president of the United States, two candidates from the Republican Party included James Garfield, who was a half-breed who wanted some civil service reform, and Chester Arthur, who was a stalwart. So you have two parts of the Republican Party that have two different, views in regard to looking at civil service reform, and you, in terms of the spoils system, and you select a vice president and who believes in vice president that believes in the spoils system, and then a presidential candidate that is a half-breed that wants to reform the spoils system. And you do that because you want to unite the party. So Republicans, of course, will vote for that ticket. President Garfield was assassinated in 1883 by Charles Guiteau, and that assassination turned public opinion away from the spoils system and led to the Pendleton Civil Service Act of 1883. And what the Pendleton Civil Service Act of 1883 did is it established qualifications and a testing system for those civil service jobs. The Republican ticket of 1880, on the left, James Garfield, half-breed. On the right, Chester A. Arthur, the stalwart. The Pendleton Civil Service Act, as we said, was a created professional civil service system which instituted written exams for appointees, and job acquisition would be based on qualifications or what you know and not who you know. Government regulation. The major economic issue of the late 1800s was the government regulation. The laissez-faire policy of the United States meant that government didn't interfere in business, and that was a Republican idea. High railroad shipping rates became a problem for farmers and small businesses. Big businesses were able to negotiate favorable rates, but railroads largely ignored everyone else. And once again, the government didn't do anything to help out small businesses and the farmers. Because once again, the government believed in laissez-faire, no regulation. Because of calls for fairness, the federal government reluctantly passed the Interstate Commerce Act, which allowed it to regulate railroad businesses that cross state lines. So because of public opinion, the federal government does come around and do some limited regulation of big businesses like the railroad. More government regulation. Tariffs became an economic issue of the late 1800s. Farmers wanted tariffs. Big businesses didn't want tariffs. They didn't want tariffs because they didn't want taxes put on products that were being sent into other countries, though these other countries would levy taxes against them. So they didn't want these high tariffs, but farmers did. Low tariffs won out in the election of 1888 as Republican Benjamin Harrison won. So in 1890, the McKinley tariff was passed to cut tariffs, helping big businesses. In 1890, the Sherman Antitrust Act was passed to curb the power of big businesses and outlaw the formation of trusts to eliminate competition. So to outlaw monopolies for the first time. All right, what we have here is a activity we want you to complete on components of the Pendleton Act to give you a little bit better understanding of what it is, of course, that the Pendleton Act does. And we'll give you 15 minutes or so to look at this particular activity. We'll come back in a few minutes and we'll go over some of the things and see if you're able to grasp and identify what some of those things are. So take this time, go through, and start working on that particular activity. Well, you should have had enough time that you were able to go to, of course, and look at that, activity, of course, on the components of the Pendleton Civil Service Act. And one of the biggest things I want you to call out, and once again, you can find the answers, of course, to this, the answer key to this at the end of in the reference section at the end of the unit. And what we want you to do is it says merit-based hiring. In other words, in order for you to have a position, it wasn't enough anymore for you to be, appointed based on who you knew. You really had to have some aptitude to do a particular job before you'd be considered for that job. And one of the things that would happen is in most cases, you'd have to be approved even after you were nominated and you went through the process. All right, that gets us to the spoil system in terms of looking at the lesson focused questions. Is why did the spoil system become such a source of political debate during the Gilded Age? Well, if you think about it, the federal government was wildly inefficient and inept. And we told you that corruption was rampant as many involved used their position to make deals that would enrich themselves financially. It wasn't about doing what you could for the American people. It's about doing what you could, of course, for yourself. So many politicians attribute that corruption to patronage of the spoil system. Therefore, it needed to be changed. Well, once again, this is Coach Anderson from Mississippi Public Broadcasting, Online U.S. History from 1877 to present. And keep in mind what we always tell you, don't take my word for it. Do your own research because it's America's history, which means it's your history. And we'll see you next time.